Let's take our Bibles, please, and turn to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11. We're going to be talking today about what I call the same old song and dance. All right, more of the same thing here. Antiochus Epiphanes is up to his antics once again. And here in Daniel chapter 11, we're going to finish up verse number 24, where I find probably about half a dozen truths within this verse. But referring to Antiochus, it says, "He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time." Now, folks, we're dealing with a turbulent period in history here of about 175 BC. And just get the timeline here. We're in between the two testaments, all right? There's 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is 175 BC. Now, what Daniel's getting here is from the angel Gabriel. Daniel had been praying for weeks about the future of his people, the Jews. And so Gabriel delivers him what's going to happen during that timeline and how this is going to work. And as Daniel is getting it here, keep in mind it's prophetic. It hadn't happened yet. Now it's history. It has happened. And history has since agreed with the Bible and everything that we're reading here. And you say, well, that's good. That's how it ought to work. History needs to agree with the Bible and not the other way around. Now, there are cynics who from time to time come along and they'll say, well, you know what? This doesn't line up with the Bible, so the Bible's not true. And they put the Bible on trial here. But the Bible says in Romans 3:4, let God be true, but every man a liar. So we're not trying to line up with history. History needs to line up with the Bible. And there are many times that the cynics have thought that the Bible is wrong. And then as time marches on, archaeology proves the Bible right. History proves the Bible right. Science proves the Bible right. And basically it catches up to the Bible. Now, both history and the Bible record the antics of Antiochus Epiphanes. And the Bible says he was vile. Remember that? That's how we're introduced to him. He was despicable, and he was. And history affirms that. So here we are talking about this guy. And in verse 24, it says, he shall enter peaceably, even unto the fattest places of the province. So he starts out peaceably. That's exactly what the Antichrist is going to do. Antiochus is a picture of the coming Antichrist, and that's why he's of interest to us. So he's going to come in with a peace platform, and people are going to be taken in by this. He uses a big act, but he's not sincere. And the Bible tells us he's going to enter into the fattest places of the land. You say, what's that talking about? The most prosperous, and that would be Israel. It's talking about riches and prosperity, and that's always been Israel and the land. While they're in the land, it's like the smile of heaven is upon that land, and it flourishes. Now, we read on in verse 24 that he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He's going to do something his dad and his grandpa and his great-grandpa didn't do. They used military might to get their way, and they had the clout behind them. Antiochus doesn't. So he's going to do something they didn't do. He's going to use a different approach. And we saw last time that it basically is what we would call socialism. Socialism. And I don't know if you caught it, but notice it says as it goes on, he shall scatter among them, notice, the prey and spoil and riches. This is what actually happened historically. And that's why I say it's the same old song and dance. He took from the rich and he gave to the poor. Something his grandpa did not do. It's basically socialism, which is a form of welfare, and it buys votes. And what Antiochus is going to do is he's going to take from the prosperous, he's going to give it to the not so prosperous, and he's basically going to distribute the wealth evenly and try and homogenize everybody, and that might sound familiar. We call that today socialism, which is a stepping stone to communism. It's nothing new. And basically, it's just buying support from the general populace and giving them government grants and so on. Now, I said last time that in any given civilization, the not so prosperous outnumber the prosperous. I don't know the ratio. It's got to be 5 to 1, 10 to 1. But yet every person gets one vote. And so here's Antiochus thinking about this. What he's aiming to do is to offend the least amount of people ratio-wise. And in the process, he'll win the vote of the majority. And he's going to do it through giveaways and freebies and subsidies and throwing money around. We're going to talk about how he threw that money around a little bit. But may I just stop and say that our country needs to quit throwing money around. We are $32 trillion in debt. And I gave you the stats of how many times we could go to the moon and back on dollar bills at $32 trillion. And so we have these politicians and they're saying, well, you know, vote for me, I'll give you this and I'll give you that. But really we need a politician to stand up and say, if I'm elected, we're going to have to tighten our belt. We're $32 trillion in debt. I mean, we can't even make the interest payment on this. And so we're going to have to just dig in, and it's going to be rough, but we need to get out of this debt because that debt is handed on to us, basically. And right now, imagine working sometime till around May every year just to pay your taxes until May in order to buy taxes for the giveaway. So we need to stop the deficit spending. Antiochus was doing the very same thing. And if we follow that pattern, all we're doing is we're saddling our kids and our grandkids with a mess, Now, I know this, it's really easy to spend somebody else's money. You ever notice that? Just, let's shoot our guns off and just blow the money. It's easy to give away somebody else's money. And Antiochus had figured that out. That would put him in a good light with the masses if he could just give this money away. Now, let me just say this. I'm not against helping those who need help, those who are trying their best, but the Bible teaches it ought to be of our own volition, our own desire. This is something that we want to do. It is unscriptural to take it from those who are working hard and give it to those who don't want to work. In Proverbs 21, it says, the desire of the slothful killeth him, for his hands refuse to labor. There are those who refuse to labor. There are help wanted signs all over town, and that goes for every town in this country. And so why should you work for money when there are those who aren't working for it, and they get the same benefits that you get basically? Back in Bible times, that did not happen. They didn't bail out somebody who is not willing to work. In fact, in Proverbs 19, it says, slothfulness casteth into a deep sleep, and an idle soul shall suffer hunger. Somebody who would not work got hungry. And that's a pretty good incentive to get to work. And by the way, the New Testament echoes that as well, doesn't it? In 2 Thessalonians, Paul says this, we commanded you that if any would not work, neither should he eat. That's pretty cut and dry. If you're not willing to work, neither should you eat. And as my pastor used to always say, if you get hungry enough, you'll start working. Now, work is not a bad thing, but yet we have a society that does not want to do it. Do you know that at the very beginning, God made us to work? In fact, even before the curse, even before the fall of man, in Genesis 2, it says, and the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And by the way, it wasn't full of weeds at that time. That all came with the curse. This was just to keep it tidy and to give man something to do, and a way at the end of the day to feel good about his progress and what he had done during the day. This is a healthy thing spawned in the mind of our Creator, this thing called work. But Antiochus Epiphanes altered that. And it's something his father, his grandpa hadn't done. And our country has altered this very thing as well. And it's rewarded laziness. And in the process, it has hurt the character of many people and given to them the spirit of entitlement. That's what it cultivates, the spirit of entitlement. It devastates any civilization, and it's not good for us. And Antiochus said, I'm going to steal from the haves. I'm going to give it to the have-nots. And that sounds like a fair thing, doesn't it? You just even the playing field and you say, that's fair now. Is it really? It's not. It's not fair to those who are willing to work. Now, there are some exceptions to this, And we all understand there are folks who really need the help. You know what? I met with one today at length. I was texting with another one today at a distance, and they really need help. And I'm thankful they're getting help. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's not a matter of being dealt a bad hand or growing up on the wrong side of the tracks or anything like that. It's normally a matter of ambition. And there's so much in the Proverbs about the sluggard and the slothful one. You say, but Pastor, shouldn't we help the poor? Yes, we should. If they're trying, if they're doing their best, if they're even trying to work and they are still hungry, of course we should help them. Jesus taught that. That's very clear from the Savior. But again, there's help wanted signs everywhere, and there are businesses going out of business, and there are folks that just don't want to work. You know, we appreciate what we work for. That's a principle. And Christ said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be. So what you pour yourself into, you have an affection for, you take pride in. And let me just say, it's rarely a matter of bad luck or lack of opportunity. We live in a land of opportunity. There are so many success stories of people who really worked. But it is normally a lack of character, and it's normally laziness. Freebies do not breed appreciation. They do the exact opposite, the spirit of entitlement. And God knows that. It's actually detrimental to us and to any society, because something given away is rarely appreciated. You know, we even charge a couple of bucks or whatever for a CD, or maybe $1, I don't know what it is, for a sermon on CD. And we could give that away, obviously. But you know, what would happen is people would begin to expect that. We could pay for the Feast of Charity every year. Everybody just come. But you know, there would be some who would say, aren't you going to do it this year now? Aren't you going to do more? I'll never forget years ago, we had, I think, a Memorial Day or Labor Day picnic, and we were down at the park, and we were serving up hot dogs and chips and a cookie and a soda and all that for $1.50. And people were happily paying it, throw it in the jar and going through and munching and so on. But there was somebody who showed up there I'd never met before that really took offense that we would charge $1.50 for a meal like that. And boy, they sat at my table and gave me an earful, and I just kind of, courteously listened. Okay, that's nice and so on. But they were relentless. And they went on and on and on. And I thought to myself, here's somebody who's been poisoned with a welfare mentality. It screams. I'll never forget in the early days of this church, my wife and I were living in the church basement. I'd come back from visitation, and she was just all concerned about this phone call she had gotten from somebody who was staying in a local motel and didn't have anything to eat and was wondering about gas money and all this. And so she emptied our cupboards. And I'm telling you, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub against each other at that time. We were living on $500 a month in the church basement with a baby. And she gathered up our food, and boy, we felt so sorry for him. I took it over there, and I knocked on the door of the motel, and I heard this voice say, "Come in." And I said, "I'm Pastor Scheving from Fargo Baptist. I brought you some food, and where can I put this?" And they didn't even look up. It was a couple laying on the bed watching the boys' state basketball tournament on TV, and they did not even look my way. They said, "Put it over there." And they just kept looking. And of course, I tried to talk to them and witness. That was why I went and give them the gospel. And they weren't the least bit interested in it. And I left with donkey ears, hee-haw, basically. And let me just say this, I'm a softy by nature. And we did that over and over again in the early days until finally I said, enough hee-haw. I gave out so much money in those days of my own with promises of, when I get to Pennsylvania, I'll pay you back. You can count. I have never gotten one dime back in all of that time, because I'm telling you, it's character. It's character. Now, in the days of the past, they had charities, they had missions, they had churches who took care of widows and orphans and the downtrodden, and the money was given of the people's free will. And we've given a lot of money over the years, and I talked about Ukraine, and I talked about a need over in Africa recently, and God's people step up, and they always have. And that's something God smiles upon. We read in Proverbs 28, "He that giveth unto the poor shall not lack." You know what that means? There's a blessing with it. God's going to take care of you if you do. But he that hideth his eyes shall have many a curse. And so God does want us helping people. But this is different from government taking it from you in excess and giving it to those who don't want to work. And it destroys incentive, and it is not fair. You know, there was a day when we could afford, basically, to give to people. And when we did, there was a sense of appreciation. It was like, wow, thank you. You bailed me out. And both the donor and the recipient had a good feeling about what they were doing. But when it goes through government hands or welfare, both recipient and donor end up with a sour look on their face. There's something wrong. There's something not right with this picture. And you have people today now that are voting according to incentives and freebies and handouts and not voting for what's best for the nation. It's the same old song and dance. You know, there was a very wise Scottish man, and I'll show you his name at the end of it, but he had this to say years ago in the 1800s. He said, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. You say, it can't. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves, he had a big word for subsidies and welfare, from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses under loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship. Have you studied history? The average age of the world's greatest civilizations has been 200 years, folks. We're on borrowed time. These nations have progressed through the sequence from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage. That was a Scottish historian, a lawyer, a writer, a college professor, a guy who had studied history, a guy who knew his stuff, and he nailed it. He really did. You know, when they were trying to hammer out the Constitution in the convention in Philadelphia many years ago, Dr. Ben Franklin headed it up, and afterwards he wandered out into the street of Philadelphia, and a woman by the name of Mrs. Powell met him. And she said, Dr. Franklin, what do we have? Do we have a monarchy or do we have a republic? He looked at her and he said, ma'am, we have a republic if you can keep it. If you can keep it. Folks, it always happens the same way. We lose it exactly the way that Scottish man said it happens. That's how history plays out. Now, again, we're not talking about the working class who are struggling financially. They're contributing into the system with their working, they're paying taxes. I have the feeling, the conviction, they're entitled to whatever help they can get if they need it. They've contributed into the system, and I'm happy to see my tax dollars go for somebody who's trying. I am talking about the help wanted signs all over the nation and those who don't want to answer them. I'm talking about businesses closing because they can't get help. And there are those who still don't want to work with no legitimate reason, and they'd rather ride on the backs of those who work, and that's not fair. And we have a lot of bleeding heart politicians who have started something, and it's gone to the extent now in this country where, how are you going to fix this? Well, there's a historian, and he said Antiochus Epiphanes did the exact same thing. And he was basically courting popularity to an excessive degree, and there's so many hints, if you read history between the lines, that Antiochus Epiphanes had a huge complex and insecurity. And there was one province where he had a bunch of gold coins minted, and he just gave them out. You say, where'd he get the money? He taxed the people. There was a method to his madness. And he had all kinds of coins. There's some of them still around. There's his image on a coin, front and back. And some were gold, some were gold-plated with bronze on the inside, some were silver, and some said different things on them. One said Antiochus the king, another said Theos, Epiphanes. We know what that means. I'm God. What an ego. Some said Antiochus Jupiter on them. That was the highest pagan god. And some actually talked about other various gods. But you have this guy with a huge ego thinking he is God. And does that ring a bell when we talk about the Antichrist? The Antichrist is going to think he's divine. Now back here in verse number 24, it says, he shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches. He was very generous with taxpayer money. Sound familiar? And historians tell us that Antiochus Epiphanes spent money like water. He had a grand theater and a Colosseum built with taxpayer money. In Antioch, he had this huge temple built to the false god Jupiter. There were other temples built to Zeus and other gods. And he spent, and he spent, and he spent, and basically he bankrupted the country because people got exhausted trying to pay taxes on their property, income tax, road taxes, sales tax, tax on top of taxes. Does that sound familiar? That's why you work until practically May every year to pay your taxes. So here's Antiochus Epiphanes. He's extremely insecure. He's trying to win favor with the people by giving away the freebies. And basically, Antiochus Epiphanes was a socialist of the 2nd century BC. Now, why is this relevant? Because again, here's a picture of the Antichrist. We are learning something about the Antichrist, and you say, well, that's in the future. I know. But everything you're seeing and everything I've been talking about is programming the population for this mindset. And we have today a country that is totally different than the days of congressmen like Davy Crockett and others who basically were hardworking people who knew that welfare would ruin the character of the country. And let me just say this, people today have been programmed with a certain mindset to where we've been seeing it going on for so long. We don't think much of it. And the Antichrist is going to capitalize upon that mindset. The world has not seen the end of socialism. Did you know that? I find it ironic that enough time has elapsed since the collapse of the Soviet Union to where a new generation has risen up of Americans who are buying into it. And may I say to you, even just 10 years ago, socialism was a bad word, wasn't it? You remember that? I'm talking just 10 years ago. And then you start hearing it and you're going, seriously? And then you hear it over and over again and you go, okay. And we have a new generation now that have made some real inroads into this. And sadly, we're about to march in where others have crawled out. It's made a mess and devastated civilizations. And if the Antichrist is a picture of Antiochus Epiphanes, the gullible are going to buy into it. And they are. Now, why didn't and why doesn't socialism work? Well, it kills incentive. It kills incentive. Why work hard if you're going to live in the same apartment as the lazy guy who doesn't want to work? And it kills morale. You know, I'll just say this. God gives us the souls that we have. And there are a certain percentage of people. They're the industrious, they're the shakers, the movers. Every society needs them. But why would they be industrious if they hit a glass ceiling and they can't go any higher than that? And so they're homogenized with everybody else. And so we see that's going to happen. It doesn't work to put everybody on the same level because God gave us all unique souls. And that's what every civilization goes with. And God also blesses industriousness, and he blesses obedience to him, and he blesses diligence. He blesses wise stewardship. He blesses generosity. And there is no chance for any of that if the government oversteps its boundaries. And we have. And they steal from the industrious and they give to the lazy. Now, the underlying reason for Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist and every socialistic platform and everything in between is basically to manipulate, to try and get control, to try and get the most of them in the offices. You really think for a skinny second that Antiochus Epiphanes cared one whit for the poor? I mean, he really couldn't care less about them. He used them for his own political gain. They were a rung on the ladder. And it's always been about control. He wanted control. Lenin wanted control. Stalin wanted control. Mao Zedong wanted control. Saddam Hussein wanted control. Pol Pot wanted control. Kim Jong-un wants control. It's all about control. It's the oldest sin known to the world. The devil is behind it. And so here's Antiochus Epiphanes. He promises these freebies, but it comes with a price tag, a heavy price tag, basically. Because really there's nothing free in this world. Those of you who've had children know from the time they're born, they cost you, don't they? It costs you to live and exist for a matter of several decades. And then when you die, it costs you money to bury you. Everything from birth to death and in between costs something. There's only one thing in the world that's free. And you know what that is? It's salvation. Oh, it cost the Son of God something. It cost him his blood. What a heavy cost. But the bottom line is there's no such thing as something for nothing. Somebody has to pay for it. Somebody has to pay for it. So what did Antiochus Epiphanes really want? Well, it's the same thing the Antichrist is going to want. It's the same thing the devil wanted. It was the devil's greatest desire from the get-go. It was control. And by the way, in this country, it's currently about control. Who's going to control the White House? Who's going to control the Congress? Who's going to control the Senate? And whatever it takes to control it. And with that control, our liberties can begin to slip away. Have you noticed our liberties slipping away? Imagine in some states already, it's assumed that the children of that state are the property. They're the property of that state. Can you imagine that? I'm talking about control. Incredible. Your children being the property of the state. You know, I dedicated all 5 of my children. My wife and I dedicated them to the Lord. That's who they belong to. That's who our children belong to. How did the state get its nose in there? And so when the state comes along and tells you how to educate your kids and how to raise your kids and what your kids need to believe and what they can do without your knowledge, and on and on and on it goes, they have way overstepped their boundaries. It's always about control. And with the Antichrist, it's going to be about control. He's going to give folks a chip so that he knows what they're buying, so that he knows where they are. And honestly, the day will come, whether it's the UN or whoever it might be, where they're going to tell you what you can do with your money, what you can do with your house, what you can do with your land, what this church can do, and what we have to give up. It's all about control. We are losing our liberties 1 inch at a time. And once we give it up, folks, here's the sad part. It's gone forever. You don't turn it back. You don't revert it back. It's gone forever. So here's the Antichrist, and he's going to like control, just like Antiochus Epiphanes. And here's Antiochus who suckered some people in with his peace platform and his treaties, and then he sees control. In fact, we're going to study on, we have a little bit of time. I want to just give you a glimpse of how this is going to work. We're going to eventually look at verse 39 in this chapter, but let's take a sneak peek ahead. Here's what the Antichrist is going to do with the Holy Land, because we know what Antiochus Epiphanes tried to do with the Holy Land. At the last part of verse number 39, it says, "And he shall divide the land for gain." You say, is that talking about the Antichrist or Antiochus Epiphanes? Yes, that's the answer. It's talking about them both. What the Antichrist is going to do is the same thing that Antiochus Epiphanes did. He tried to gain some support and popularity and the backing of the simple by starting to divide the Holy Land. Now, folks, I don't know if you know how serious this is. This has been the matter of the ages. That land that Israel is now in is not a fraction of what God originally gave to them. And don't ever forget, God gave it to them. The ungodly are always trying to take some of that land away. And it's still in the news daily. They're trying to divide the land, divvy out the land. Nobody has a right to tell them what to do with that land but God. This is a very dangerous thing. And honestly, I don't know if you're a student of even U.S. history, but there have been numerous natural disasters whenever a dignitary, an ambassador, a diplomat, a president has tried to shove the Jews into giving up some of their land. and it's more than coincidental. It happens over and over and over again. God himself deeded that land to Abraham and his descendants way back in Genesis, way back in the Pentateuch. And so we come along today and we say, well, what do we do with the West Bank? What do we do with the Gaza Strip? And we start divvying up the land. I'm telling you, that's dangerous. And that's an end time sign. Joel is an end times book. And we find God saying here in Joel 3:2, I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered amongst the nations and parted my land. Now this is the last day prophecy, and this is what's going to be going on. The dividing of the land is a last days sign. Don't forget that. God is very, very sensitive about the Jews and their land. They go together. There's something about that. Now, if God expels them from the land for a season, and he did with Nebuchadnezzar, and he did again with Rome, that's God's business. And that's how he deals with the Jews. But the Jews have to be in that land in the end times. All Bible prophecy points to Israel being in that land. And that's why May of 1948 was so significant. Folks, that was huge. After 1900 years, they're back in the land again. And so the stage is set. Now, God has always dealt with Israel based on their land because he's given them that land for an everlasting possession. And this goes way back to Genesis. Here he is, he's talking to Abraham. He says, and I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. How long is everlasting? Well, it's still in the year we're living in here. And God, again, reconfirms this later on with Abraham's grandson Jacob. And so we find here that the Jews, they have that land. And somebody comes along, they say, well, it's not fair for the Jews to deprive Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan and Syria of that land. Let me just say this. Forget your sense of fair when it comes to the land. God has spoken. He has the final word. Honestly, I don't even express my opinions when God has spoken. They don't matter. God has spoken when it comes to that land. And I don't speculate. I remember an old song, and it said, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it for me. And while all that's true, whether I believe it or not, it settles it if God has said it, and God has said it. Well, we find that Antiochus Epiphanes is going to play Robin Hood. He's going to take from the haves, give it to the have-nots, and it's going to catapult him to the top. At first, he's a rock star. I'm telling you, he's so popular. But it didn't last forever. And back here in verse 24 of Daniel 11, we find out a little hint of what happened, and it's the last part of verse 24. It's these words, even for a time. So he gives that money away, divides Israel. He's doing everybody's favors and subsidies and freebies and welfare. And it works for a while, but notice those last four words in the verse, even for a time. You say, Pastor, what happened? It backfired. Within 5 years, Antiochus Epiphanes is dead. And we'll pick up with verse 25 next time. Let's close here in prayer.